Well, hello, folks. Good afternoon again, and welcome to yet another one of our TESS seminars. And of course, TESS is our Center for Tropical, Environmental, and Sustainability Science here at JCU, which is one of our main vehicles for promoting terrestrial and some aquatic research, not marine realm. We don't work in the oceans, but we do work a lot in forests, not just in this region, but all around the world, really. We have people working in Latin America and African tropics, Madagascar, Asia's Pacific tropics. I mean, it's just, list goes on and on. So it's a real pleasure today to identify FrogID, to identify Jodi Rowley, to introduce Jodi Rowley. Jodi's with the Australian Museum and the University of New South Wales. I didn't see too much about your training, but she's obviously a frog biologist extraordinaire. She's responsible for a lot of work in amphibians and frogs, and I will let her tell you all about that. But she has, in fact, played a key role in scientifically describing 40 species of frogs. I don't know how many of you, anybody done 40 species of anything here? That's a lot. That's a heck of a lot, including something called the flying vampire frog. Are we going to hear about that today at all? No. It's not Australia. Okay, all right. So no flying vampire frogs today. Anyway, but without further ado, it's a real pleasure to introduce Jodi Rowley. Thanks very much, Jodi.
Thank you so much. It's so fun to be here today and a privilege to talk in this seminar. A kind of a very whirlwind trip. So yeah, I'm really pleased that I could make it. I'm going to be talking about FrogID, obviously, which is the vast majority of what I do, but I guess don't know how many have got super frog backgrounds, just a touch on frogs in general. And I have to update this slide, unfortunately, both in terms of the number of species, but also in terms of the number of threatened species every time I give this talk. So it's exciting that now there's 257 species of native frog, because when we launched FrogID, I think there was 241. And so we're still figuring out what frogs we have, which is exciting. There's still room for lots of discovery, and many of you are helping with that discovery using FrogID. But unfortunately, and this was kind of the driver towards FrogID, at least 4 species of Australian frog are extinct. It's likely more than that because there's a lot missing in action. And 54, and this like jumped by about 10 since the last time I actually gave a big talk with this in it, are now threatened with extinction. So we're not doing very well in terms of a track record for frog conservation. Threats are, I guess, very similar to the threats for most of our biodiversity. Habitat loss and modification is by far the biggest threat. Many frogs are very sensitive to any kind of environmental change, and so even though it can look kind of the same to us, they can then disappear. Disease has hit frogs really hard, particularly the amphibian chytrid fungus, particularly along Eastern Australia and this part of the world, and that's the reason I actually moved up here to do my PhD many moons ago, was because the rainforest stream frogs up here were in a lot of trouble, and we needed to try and figure out some of, why some were doing well and some weren't. Introduced species and also increasingly climate change. So there was just a second global amphibian assessment that sort of took a look at all the amphibians that we had enough information for around the world, and compared to about a decade ago, actually no, more than that, 2004, we have a lot more species that have been identified as starting to be threatened by climate change, which is not surprising. So why do we care though? Why are frogs so awesome? I mean, I actually just fell in love with frogs because I thought they were amazing. Toepads, eyeballs, just amazing. But frogs are in many places, and you're living in the right place for it, but they are generally really abundant. And so you can get incredibly high biomass. In places in the US, in many cases, the salamander biomass can be the highest part of the terrestrial vertebrates. So if you sort of made imaginary piles of all the animals in the forest, sometimes it's insane, but the salamander pile would be the biggest. So when we lose them, it's not surprising it has flow-on effects. They also connect aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So most frogs deposit eggs in fresh water, which is a delicious treat for everything that lives in there. Then the tadpoles are mostly eaten by everything as well. And then they emerge onto the land as frogs, if they're lucky enough, and then sort of play a really important part in connecting these two ecosystems. Really important part of food webs. Tadpoles are typically grazers, so you don't think of them, but it's almost like losing two things when you lose frogs. You lose the things that eat the algae, and even after decades, other animals like aquatic invertebrates don't seem to step up and fill the role that tadpoles have. And adult frogs are huge consumers of lots of invertebrates, including pest species. And there's some anecdotal kind of evidence that potentially during amphibian declines in Central America that the malaria rates actually increased. That's not because frogs mostly don't care enough to eat something as small as a mosquito, but the actual tadpoles compete with them in the streams. And so that's one of the selfish reasons we might want frogs around. Also, frogs are like little petri dishes in the forest, and so they excrete all sorts of chemicals and compounds in their skin that have been explored for use in sort of human medicine. So antivirals, anti-cancers, sunscreen, birth control. This lump up there is the Holy Cross frog, and the goo that you see on its back has actually been investigated for use in human knee cartilage surgery. So it's got a weird trait for a glue, which is that it's as sticky when it's wet as when it's dry, which is cool when it comes to sort of internal surgeries. And frogs are also really great bioindicators. Not all species, there are some species that will breed in your dog bowl, but the vast majority of frogs are highly sensitive to any kind of environmental change. And one of the biggest problems when it comes to figuring out how best to allocate our finite resources to helping frogs out is that we actually don't know that much about them. So this is a figure of the number of frog species known from Australia over time. And you can see we're still going straight up. And in the last 10 years, 21 frog species have been described as new to science in Australia. So, I mean, I know we definitely think of sort of invertebrates and plants when it comes to species discovery, but we're still not there yet, certainly for our frogs, which is crazy. And for the species that we do know exist, there are huge gaps in knowledge in terms of their distributions, for example. So this was a map that I got from the Atlas of Living Australia that I made using data, just to show that there are huge parts of Australia, even very close to Perth, which is pretty populated, where there are hundreds of kilometres where we actually have no official frog records. Now, it's not surprising, this was then the driver behind FrogID, which we launched at the Australian Museum in November 2017. So I think that's almost 8 years. And it was to try and get the data that we need to try and help save Australia's frogs. There are amazing frog biologists around Australia, but there's not that many of them, and it would take us 10,000 lifetimes to get the data that we need to make informed conservation decisions. And by then it will probably be too late. So we need everybody's help. So FrogID is all based around the smartphones. Who here uses FrogID or has FrogID? Okay, so there's some people to convert. Excellent. Okay, so it's all based around the frogs that around the concept that every frog species has a different call, just like birds. And so they're essentially yelling out what species they are. We don't need to get our feet wet. We don't need to disturb their habitat. We just get out there, press record for 20 to 60 seconds, and then we don't even have to write anything, do anything, just submit. That recording, that audio then gets submitted to the cloud, and then myself and my team at the Australian Museum sit with earphones on, and we listen to those recordings and we identify the frogs that are calling. And so this is what the back end of FrogID looks like. So we get a call come in. This is one of my recordings that I submitted. I was in the northern tablelands of New South Wales. I was down a gorge with no mobile reception. And I recorded a frog. It's got the latitude, the longitude. The accuracy is to 6 meters. It's crazy our phones know where we are even when we can't make a call or do anything mildly creepy. I could have put a photo, attached a photo of the habitat. I didn't because I was climbing and I didn't. It was in a creek, and so I put some notes. I could have actually written stuff down as well, but I didn't. And I guessed that it was the red-backed toadlet, and I'm a pretty good guesser when it comes to frog calls, so I was right. But this is a sort of an example of what we see and what comes through when you press record, submit. Now, I've written a note here, the FrogID AI, and I guess many of you might have been surprised hearing that we actually listen to every single frog recording. We are working on a big FrogID AI project, and now we have these kind of identified calls. That's putting us in a really good place. I was chatting briefly at lunch about that, but if you've got those kind of questions around FrogID AI, then hit me up at the end and we can chat more. The short of it is we're not there yet, but it's getting there. But a lot of people say one of the best things about FrogID is the fact that you're actually talking to a real person and get a real response. So I think there's going to be some sort of balance in things, but more on that later. So how have we done? Now, when we first launched FrogID, I remember sitting down after I'd done a bunch of TV and tried to get the word out, and we actually didn't even have this sort of back end made properly. I couldn't even check different pages. I could only see the first page. And I thought, well, you know, it might just be my mum and a couple of friends that are being forced to use it. Do people really care? Will people really walk outside and record frogs? And I guess turns out the answer is yes, people do care and they will stand outside and record frogs. So we've had over 100,000 registered users record almost 900,000 audio recordings that has so far resulted in more than 1.3 million records of frogs for the vast majority of Australia's frog species. Obviously, we're hoping that there's more frog species in terms of people rediscovering extinct species and things like that, but that's not bad. And we've got a really good distribution across Australia. And I remember sitting there that first night and I could just see the calls coming in like boop, boop, boop. I'm like, oh my gosh, what have we created? It's pretty amazing. Now, to put that into perspective, before FrogID, Australia had about 500,000 frog records. Many of them were kind of northern New South Wales, or, you know, bad accuracy, can't check the ID, weren't associated with any kind of, you know, voucher or photo or anything like that. So it's pretty impressive in the short time that FrogID has been going, relatively speaking, how many records we've created. And compared to iNaturalist, which is the world's largest citizen science project, globally for the whole world, they've got about 2 million frog records that are research grade. So 3 people have said the same thing. And about 98,000 from Australia, not all identified to species. So we're kind of kicking butt, which is really great. So there's nothing else like FrogID. We're pretty good spatial coverage. It's a citizen science project, so it's where the people are. But so far, we have 40% of Australia with a FrogID record on it. So we've divided Australia up into grid cells of half a decimal degree, and we're trying to get as many, initially 50% is a goal, as many places in Australia with a record of a frog as possible. There are a couple of little places where maybe there are no frogs, but the vast majority of Australia does have frogs. It's just really hard to get there when it rains is part of the problem. So you really need Johnny on the spot, which is why FrogID is doing well, because we get some Johnnies on the spot. And if you want to actually get this map, you can download a shapefile. Or actually, maybe I have to send you the shapefile. You can see this map though. If you want the shapefile, email me. But you can see this file that we update regularly, and so you'll be able to actually find those grid cells. So I don't know if anyone here knows Keith McDonald. Yeah, he's an amazing naturalist that's obsessed with plants and frogs and everything else. But he got right behind FrogID, and he asked me to update this map, send it to him all the time, and he uses it like a treasure map. So he's like, right, I'm going to go get new grid cells. And he's the person, you know, he's amazing, respected, you know, now retired scientist that is awesome, because he just goes out and he's got, I think, 11 new grid cells on FrogID. So he's the equal #1 in terms of new grid cells, which is amazing. So we're trying to get coverage across Australia. But FrogID is also really cool because it's actually getting data from places where there is no other data. So even though we're only 40% of Australia, that's still good. We actually have 235 grid cells where the only frog record in those grid cells is FrogID data. So we really are putting frogs on the map, and particularly for some reason in Western Australia. Not 100%, but there's still some places in, well, there's one place in North Queensland up there as well. FrogID is the most rapid collection of frog records in the world. So November 2021 was a particular peak, as you can see. And in that sort of month, we have the FrogID week. It was after COVID. I think everyone got out there after the fires, after the floods. And on the 12th of November, we got 6,208 occurrence records of frogs. So that's 4.3 frog records per minute, which is absolutely astounding. This does take us some time to go through. And so I'm just going to run through some of the really cool findings. And I guess that was my mission when we launched FrogID. Now that everyone out there is using it, or as heaps of people are out there using it, was how can I prove that to them, to everyone who's spending their time out there recording frogs, but also to government and funders and people that the data is useful, that we can trust it, that we can make conservation decisions based upon it, and we can do good science based upon it. So one of the first and most obvious things that we've been doing, I guess, is we've been actually properly mapping frogs. So before FrogID, the best maps we had, and I'm going to use this little black soil toadlet as an example, the best maps we had were the IUCN Red List maps here, and so there's a nice blob. In 2022, we produced the Australian Frog Atlas, and we used a combination, mostly FrogID records, but also Atlas of Living Australia Museum specimens, data, everything that we could get. And we mapped the distribution, and you can see, I mean, at least it kind of looks better. It looks more detailed. And this is open access and downloadable. But then a couple of years later, we got this frog record of this little black soil toadlet with a very distinctive call, and the guy submitted photos too, which was fantastic. 280 kilometers from where we thought this frog was. And so in the next version of the Australian Frog Atlas, we've now had to remap the species, and we do this on a roughly annual basis. So we're about to, or maybe not about to release, but in the next few months, we should have the FrogID, so the Australian Frog Atlas version 3 as well. So based upon all the recordings that people make, we're actually having to seriously amend the maps very often so that we can more accurately understand where our frogs are, which is absolutely amazing. FrogID is pretty good at getting threatened species records for some threatened species, particularly when local communities kind of use FrogID as a tool, which is what we want, to get out there and map the frogs. And one of the best examples is not far from here, and that's the magnificent brood frog. So the local community groups, Magnificent Brood Frog Working Group, Bush Heritage, Cape York Herp Society, decided they would use FrogID and they would go and resurvey all these historical sites for this frog, given the impending threat of the wind power infrastructure. And so since then, we've provided those records. We've now got 262 records in advance of the annual releases that we put out to the Queensland government to reassess the species. And so it can be a really, really important tool. And then, of course, the Kuranda tree frog as well. We have amazing community out there that also do use FrogID up at Kuranda, and we now have 212 records of this critically endangered species, including one a while back that was from a creek that was suspected but not yet reported from. The impacts of land use change, particularly one of my former PhD students, who's now part of the team as a researcher, Gracie Liu, did a lot of work, I guess, to support the fact that frogs are bioindicators. So she got all the FrogID data, she paired it with a measure of habitat modification, land use change, and she assessed sort of whether frogs were intolerant or tolerant of habitat modification. And this was a while ago, but back then she found that 70% of all Australian frogs that we have enough data for, at that time it was only 87 species, but they were intolerant of human habitat modification. So things like the crawling toadlet, the bleeding frog, the ticking frog, they're actually WA guys. And I guess the inverse, so the ones that actually like human modification, which is potentially not surprising, the striped marsh frog, which is the frog that's literally in everyone's backyard in Sydney, and I have many of them. The white-lipped tree frog, Latoria frenata, which is up here. And strangely, I don't know if anyone from the southeast, Crinia signifer, the common eastern froglet, is like absolutely everywhere. But it actually turns out that just doesn't care at all. It doesn't like human place habitats. It just doesn't care at all. It's in the bush, it's in your backyard. It actually didn't show that it was any sort of preference for things. Gracie recently repeated that data. Now we've got that analysis. Now we've got more data, and it was 84% of the species, were intolerant of human modification, which is, again, not surprising because the species that we have less data for are likely to be the species that are less tolerant. But another really powerful use of FrogID data. And she's also done a study that found that, sort of along the same lines, but found that frogs actually have longer breeding seasons in urban environments compared to non-sort of modified environments, which is possibly because we build backyard ponds that stay there, they don't dry out. FrogID is really great at detecting invasive species. So it's a fantastic tool to monitor the spread of the cane toad. And we provide monthly reports to New South Wales and WA governments on the distribution, any cane toads that are sort of out of the range. And certainly we're going to need to redo our maps based upon some of the recent recordings that we've received, particularly from WA, unfortunately. But FrogID has also highlighted some species that are native, that are, I mean, this is the best or worst example, depending on which way you look at it, bad for the environment, but the frog's having a great time. The eastern dwarf tree frog is actually had a population sort of in Melbourne since the 1990s, and then there was a tiny little population known from northeast Victoria. But since FrogID's been going, these populations have been expanding, and there's been new ones popping up here and there. So they're now in Canberra. They seem to be able to survive the winter there. And they've spread across the border from Victoria into Albury. And now they're in the range of species that they've never been in the range before of. So things like the threatened Sloan's froglet, we don't know what implications that's going to have. The other thing that's interesting about the native frogs establishing populations outside their native range, and this isn't the only one, it's just the best one at doing it, is that no one knows what to do. Like, government doesn't know what to do. They're like, what do you want me to do? I'm like, I don't know, I'm reporting it. It's not from there, you know, and I'm reporting it to you, but because it's not an introduced species, it's sort of, not, no one knows what to do. Excitingly, FrogID has been helping a lot with new scientific discovery of frog species in Australia. So since FrogID launch, FrogID data has been used in the scientific description recognition of 13 new frog species, and that's just some of them. I think 10 have been had our FrogID team involved, but they've been incredibly important for trying to figure out, I guess, not just prove additional evidence that the frog is different because the calls are different, but also then allows us to map the distributions better because you can listen to the calls and plot them, and allows us to describe the species much faster because we don't have to get out there and record the frogs ourselves, which can be challenging if it's one of those frogs that only calls like a couple of times a year when it's flooding. Now we have this data on our fingertips, and it's also useful because we can see what kind of habitats that the frogs are living in and breeding in. So it provides us sort of, okay, if they're in people's backyards and they're in a lot of different kind of habitats, it's maybe less threatened, for example, than something that's only restricted to bushland and a specific type of water. One relatively recent example of this was the laughing tree frog, or Roth's tree frog, which formerly was distributed, we thought it was distributed across the whole top end of Australia from Queensland through NT to WA. And I remember when I first launched FrogID, actually, I hadn't really told anyone about it. I told my former PhD supervisor, Ross Alford, hey, Ross, download this app, you know, have a play with it, tell me what you think. And he got on and he went, yeah, but your call for Latoria rothi is wrong. Like, that's not the call. And that was just a demonstration of like, yeah, they do sound different in Queensland to the rest of Australia. And so FrogID was really important in trying to figure out sort of, I guess, Latoria brubunda, the western laughing tree frog, which was newly described, was actually more closely related to a frog in Indonesia than it was to Latoria rocki, the original as well, which is surprising. But yeah, definitely the Queensland ones are much shorter calls, more like instead of I don't know, something like that. And one of relevance up here as well was the banjo frogs. So Tom Parkin in my team relied heavily on FrogID recordings in his revision of these guys, and they found that what was formerly Pteroreginae was a frog that we thought occurred quite widely distributed. We realised that actually the real name is the superb banjo frog, which is only restricted to Cape York, and then ended up renaming the scarlet-sided banjo frog Rumenatus greyi. And then the coastal banjo frog was just along this narrow strip along Sydney, and there's potentially in a bit of trouble because it likes the kind of places that humans like. But if anyone's up Cape York, please try and get recordings of the superb banjo frog. We only have 15 submissions to FrogID, and I think about half of them were Tom when he went up looking for these guys. But yeah, another really important frog to help put on the map and understand. It's very poorly known, and they're beasts. I think they're one of Australia's biggest frogs, but they're like the females are absolutely massive. I would love to see one. Yeah. It's also kind of been a bit of an apocalypse since FrogID was launched. So particularly in Eastern Australia, we've had drought, followed by the Black Summer bushfires, followed by floods. And in particular, the fires, I mean, I remember watching on television, and we were wearing masks before COVID was a thing because we could hardly breathe in Sydney. There was like black, eucalyptus leaves flying down at us. I went out to do a rescue for the Burralong frog, which is a threatened frog that I work on, and its streams had turned into like the surface of the moon, and we were going around trying to find any that were left so that we could take them. And I remember I had to take leave because it was, I don't know, it was a high risk because everything was gonna, burn. Yeah, it was terrifying going in there. And then I just thought, the frogs and the fires, they're all just going to, turn into a puff of smoke. So we really desperately need to go figure out what they're doing. But then, of course, as soon as we had the chance to get out there and see how our frogs and biodiversity was faring, we couldn't. We were all in lockdown. And so that's when FrogID actually really came even more in handy. So people got out there. We asked them, please record the frogs in your local area. If you've got any kind of, just keep doing it, but any burnt habitat. We had guys that would like grab a pizza and drive for 4 hours every Friday night, go around their local government area within their range, and they would just take recordings, pull over. And so within 125 days of the fire, we had 3,500 frog records in this burnt area. Now we've got about 45,000 records of frogs in that area. And that allowed us at the time to produce the first scientific paper that I'm aware of, and I'll keep saying that until someone corrects me, but I think I'm right, actually having data rather than a guess as to the impact of the fire on frogs. The good news was that frogs were like calling days after the fire, and the vast majority of frog species that we had there, they had some at least short-term persistence. We've done some follow-up work as well. Certainly there are frogs that are not captured well by citizen science data that, and definitely scientific surveys are still needed, but it was a nice good news story. And that was also reflected. I did manage to get out once before lockdown and see some of the really burnt areas on the New England tablelands, and it blew my mind, like how you could see the frogs emerging from sort of under the trees and under the rocks. Some of them had like tiny burns on themselves, but then they were breeding and there was tadpoles everywhere. It was kind of blew my mind. Obviously, we don't know the long-term consequences, the genetic consequences, all those kind of things, but at least it was a little bit of good news in kind of a terrifying time. We're actually finding potentially the floods were worse for frogs than the fires as well. So I mentioned it was an apocalypse, and I just wanted to sort of touch on that a little bit more. So in the lockdown still, in winter 2021, I think probably many of you saw things on social media where people were just reporting dead frogs. And you don't often see dead frogs. They probably don't always die at your doorstep, although we were at home more, so maybe we were noticing a little bit more. And they decompose or get eaten by birds and things like that really, really quick. And so I remember I did one radio interview on the North Coast, and then all of a sudden people just started emailing me. And then I talked to a few other people and like, you hearing this, are you seeing dead frogs all over social media? And so then we did this article, Carrie Rose from Toronto Zoo and myself wrote an article and said, are you seeing dead frogs? Because we can't get out there and investigate it. Can you report it? And because we had this amazing FrogID audience, everyone out there, people did report it. And so I remember I knew that this article was going to go live at like the next day. And I remember waking up and I could hear my email just going like bing, bing, bing. And that first day, we got 161 reports from particularly the East Coast Australia of dead and dying frogs. And we got over 1,600 reports that winter of 50 frog species, largely green tree frogs, but possibly because they tend to be around your house and they're big and you see them more often. Well, it's the most depressing time of my life. Sitting there, I was 16 hours a day replying to people saying, if it's a sick frog, here's the local vet that said that they'll help you. If it's a dead frog, we asked people in New South Wales to actually ziplock the dead frogs, put them in their freezer with a label, and we would come around and pick them up when we could. And it's crazy, but people did. So we have now over 600 dead frogs mostly from that mortality event that we actually drove around New South Wales picking up dead frogs, because otherwise we would have no way to be able to test and figure out what's going on. And I guess, we talk about engagement and citizens, this is like next level. They're putting frogs next to their frozen peas in the freezer and allowing us to test it. So we've tested them all for the amphibian chytrid fungus. We've done a bunch of other work. We're still continuing. So that's an ongoing process, and that is only possible thanks to like citizen science at the next level of people actually doing this for us, not just recording frogs. And we have one paper out so far that actually looked to see whether there was a link to pesticides and the frog mortality event, which overall it didn't seem like there were, but we got more than a third tested positive for at least one pesticide. And that was the first report of anticoagulant rodenticide, so like rat poison in frogs. So even though it didn't actually seem that it was consistent enough that it's likely to be a driver, it's certainly not a good thing. And it does reinforce, though, frogs as bioindicators. I mean, a lot of them have things like DDT in them, which, breakdowns of DDT, which haven't been, been in use for a very long time. And maybe floods had a little bit to do with that too. So in addition to the publications that we're trying to sort of put together, and you can check out all our 30 publications so far, and we'll be adding to them, check out our science page. We do annual exports to state wildlife and federal wildlife atlases and the Atlas of Living Australia. So we're just finished. Hopefully I've got to do the final check maybe tomorrow, of the next annual release of the FrogID data. So we go through it, and we're hoping machine learning can help us a little bit with sort of detecting outliers and things, but at the moment it's a very kind of manual process where we look for any kind of range outliers, figure out if we need to redo the maps or if we need to actually change the frog records. Obviously, we also have to update based upon all the new species described, so we try and do that as soon as possible. The latest one was Latoria rubella, the red tree frog, which is now 3 species, so we have to go through that process. And it's also been integrated into conservation management. So in New South Wales, it's recommended for people doing threatened frog surveys, which is really great. And we have a little button that you can click to tell us that it is, and we try and do it faster and have another level of expert on it as well. And it's also recommended for use for threatened species in specific sort of federal conservation plans. Now, so, I mean, this is what, as a scientist, I was like super obsessed with the data, the papers, trying to get, the information that we need to help save frogs. And it's kind of over the course of, I think about, 3 or 4 years, I've kind of broken down and I actually realized maybe that's not the most important thing about FrogID. And some of the feedback we receive from people has kind of brought a lot of tears to my eyes. I just thought I'd highlight some pretty amazing quotes that we've received from FrogID. So, for example, 3 months ago, I knew nothing about frogs, and now it's all I see and hear. Someone else, as a farmer, I feel it's good to know what type of frogs are about and how they're going in the environment. The health of my waterways through the property is important. This project keeps me in touch with which species are around and can be telling us what's happening to my water health. And the last one, which is cute, within a very short space of time, our frog knowledge and awareness has expanded. And recently, very late one evening, after being on the road for 11 hours, we passed through a shower of rain. We didn't think twice at pulling the car off the highway to listen to frogs. Our life has become far richer. And there's all these kind of stories through FrogID. Like, we have this amazing guy that lives in Nhulunbuy in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory. And when he drives to Darwin, he does it at night. And he stops along the Arnhem Highway, and you can literally see, like, on the FrogID map where he's gone. You've got amazing guys. One guy did, again in the NT, it was like an 80-kilometre range extension for the striped rocket frog, just grabbing a beer on his deck. You know, you can make these really huge sort of important things, but it's really cool to hear. And one of my former PhD students worked on a paper where she did a lot of really long interviews with FrogID users. And you can read more about that. You can use the sort of QR codes at the bottom, but I picked a few out today because I thought they were cool as well. So someone said, I feel like I'm helping people like FrogID scientists, either immediately or somewhere down the track, by recording what I saw or heard for someone to use today or sometime in the future. And it might not be us, it might be a generation from now. And I feel like that's a good way of, sorry, can't speak. And I feel like that's a good way of adding meaning to life. And there was quite a lot in that paper as well about, like, people actually changing their behaviour. So someone said, I'm a bit more proactive in protecting the frogs. I continually ask my husband not to use sulphate or ammonia on the lawn. We don't use any chemicals anyway, but now it's a definite no. And this one made me laugh. The best thing about FrogID is knowing that in retirement, I can still do something that adds value, not just sitting on my expletive. So I'm really, really, you know, as a conservation biologist, and there's many of you here, it can be super depressing. Like, it's rarely good news, especially in the frog world. You know, I don't know how we're going to turn things around. Things aren't looking good, but FrogID has given me hope. You know, when I was sitting at home and all the frogs were dying, the fact that I was getting people from across Australia that cared, that were sending me before and after photos of Freddie, you know, that had, like, dropped out of a pot dead, you know, that people care enough to get out there, record Sloane's froglet in -2 degrees in the middle of winter and submit that. It's, you know, it's amazing to be part of something like this. So thank you all the people that actually use FrogID. If you haven't, please do consider it. There's a team of us at the Australian Museum and beyond that are working really hard to make the data that you collect count and be used for really important frog research. And of course, it's available to researchers as well. So if anyone's out there that's thinking of a great project, we have a lot of data. We both have the occurrence data, we have the audio recordings, and we want that to be used for the betterment of frogs, the betterment of our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jodi. That was a very lively and interesting and exciting talk. And questions, either online or here? Okay, here. And we have to use the mic because otherwise it doesn't get recorded. So that's why we need to use the microphone.
That was great, Jodi. Really nice to see a data set from the same source that has, like, over 1 million records and not like 50 records. So it's really good to see what you guys can do with it. I guess I was just wondering about the areas that don't, you know, the inherent problem of people being in certain areas and not in others. A couple of things that I've just been thinking about. Have you thought about trying to incentivize, like, having a wish list of, like, grid cells or species records or habitats or something like that? Or would that then skew the data in ways you don't want? Like, you could have targeted ads on Facebook or something. And I did have another. Oh, the other one was, like, I guess with a data set this large, like, one of the, you know, the sort of gold standard for ecological survey data is that you want to have it randomized spatially or temporally or at least regular or something like that, and this is not, how much like correction can you do if you want to know if you want to try and do like population estimates or something like that from this sort of data, which might not be traditionally what you'd use? How much correction can you do from other like spatial data, like, population centers and that kind of thing?
Okay, let's see if I can remember that. Firstly, incentivizing. So we try and tell people a lot to check that map out, and some people are incentivized by that. We do have a leaderboard in terms of just general numbers of frogs, like submissions and things, and the ability to share your profile, like bits of it if you want, so like bragging rights. Every FrogID week we have a list of priority species, but we avoid critically endangered or like highly rare. We don't want to like drive people to sensitive habitat. We have done a paper that demonstrated that if you provide people like via email every 2 weeks, we did a few LGAs and said, these are high priority grid cells, can you try and go there? They do, because the results of the surveys indicate that like FrogID's goals are the same as the people using FrogID's goals. So that's like perfect match. People want to collect good scientific data, and things that they can do to help it, often people will. And we currently have a project in the northern wheat belt of New South Wales, led by Gracie Liu, that is actually looking at trying to get better data in some of these like really difficult places where there's not many people living. A lot of the land's private property, but big private property, and it's black soil. So as soon as it rains, you basically get stuck and can't go anywhere. So we're working on ways to actually, I guess, incentivize or drive people to get better biodiversity data. Obviously, it depends on your goals, the data, right? So that's to cover that goal, but recording one frog in a backyard pond in Sydney every day, it can actually be really important for understanding things like breeding habitat, recording big choruses that are like hideously messy. And so there's all different ways that the data can be useful. So for different goals, and we have, there's a lot. In terms of the bias, then yeah, we get, we're getting mostly recordings from the most populated places and mostly common frogs. I think there's something insane, like 400,000 recordings of common eastern froglets now. So we spend a lot of time when we do any kind of analysis, depending on what it is, trying to, if we've got a question of before and after fires, for example, we had less data before the fires because we had less FrogID and it wasn't that popular, and more data after. So we end up then having to resample the data so that we don't skew it. We use a lot of grid cells and radiuses, and we take a lot of other sort of, make sure there's spatial and temporal sort of balance. But again, like some other things where we're now trying to select really high quality core recordings for machine learning, and that is, it doesn't really matter. Well, we want to get some representation, but yeah, it just depends on the question, I guess. We want to give people the ability to do more, but we also don't want to give them too much information, because everything's useful, and the more structure you tell people, like now record temperature, then less likely that anyone's going to do it. Quite frankly, I'm surprised that people go outside and record a frog anyway. So yeah, we appreciate that.
Okay, other questions? Huh?
Yes,
oh,
please,
online? Yeah, Noel, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. It's Noel Press here, Jodi. That was a great talk, thank you. And FrogID is brilliant. It's I use it quite a lot. Probably don't upload as many as I should, but yeah. I was just wondering about the technology behind it. What's the platform you used for FrogID, or did you develop it yourself? And would it be adaptable to a single species, an endangered species, the spectacled flying fox?
So yeah, we developed the app ourselves, and by I'm not an app developer, but I helped with the science part of it. And so, yeah, that was sort of a lot of pre-work. And then we use like a cloud service, which I think we might be sort of changing at the moment on the back end. So it is, yeah, it would be complicated to make it something else, but not impossible. Our first step is definitely potentially expanding to other countries, keeping on the frog theme, especially if we can get machine learning to help with our goals. And at the moment there's a bit of a lag in us identifying the frog calls, which we feel really bad about. So apologies if you haven't had all your calls identified, but we're hoping that machine learning can help with that as well. So yeah, I guess in theory, yes. Platforms like iNaturalist could be used as well for other taxa. The issue with, especially if it's a single species, the issue with iNaturalist is that at this point in time, it doesn't allow multiple species to be tagged in one thing. So if you submit a call recording and you're only interested in flying foxes, then that's fine. So it's always better to use existing platforms, because every time an operating system like Apple or Google changes something, you've got to pay people money to fix things. So it's better to try and use something that someone else is paying for, if at all possible. So I do recommend, if you, not for frog calls, because that's FrogID, but for other things generally, iNaturalist, if you can make a group in that and try and encourage people to submit to iNaturalist.
Okay, sorry. Other questions?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Somebody online?
No,
A
that's-
lady?
Hi, yes, Eleni here. Sorry, I'm out and about at the moment, so if it's hard to hear me, I apologize. But I'm just a FrogID user who is very curious to join the presentation, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much for broadcasting and making it available remotely. But I was just going to ask a question about the direction which you'll be using AI and machine learning to help with frog identification. Because I know I have a few connections because I work as an engineer, and I know a few people who have developed neural networks before, and was wondering if you do each call manually, that's quite tedious. So I'm sure, if you wanted, I don't know, any advice or anything, I was just curious what the developments are in the future.
Thank you. Feel free to flick me an email. But yeah, so we're working on a big AI project at the moment. I'm lucky enough we've got a machine learning engineer on board who was previously with NASA, and she's amazing. She loves birds and frogs, so that's why she's come on board. I guess the acoustic AI space is moving really, really rapidly. So since we started doing this, there's some, and I've been telling everyone about it, there's the best thing around, but I mean, you do have to code in Python, or at least ask another form of AI to help you code in Python. But Nature LM, for example, is a new model out that's a little bit like Chat GPT, where you can just write, what is the animal calling in this? And it literally, it's pretty amazing. It's not trained a lot on frog data. It's mostly birds, because that's what most of the world of acoustics is, but it's pretty amazing. Obviously, BirdNet was the first kind of model that came out that people started using. Google Perch has kind of superseded that, and so we're working on kind of using these models and retraining them basically on Australian frog data using FrogID. At the moment, we're using our weekly labeled data. So at the moment, we don't have timestamps, from 1 second to 2 seconds, it's this. It's just somewhere in this recording, it's that and that. So we're working on a better sort of tagging interface for that. I guess, the issue with, as opposed to these passive recorders that you put the data out, then you want to trawl through it, and it probably is okay if there's a little error rate. The problem with FrogID recordings is we want every species there and not any that aren't. And so getting that species checklist is really hard. AI doesn't give you yes, no, it gives you probabilities for 50 species. And so kind of then saying, well, what is in this? So initially we'll probably be using it as a engagement tool, a bit like the BirdNet and sort of the Merlin app does. And then trying to see where we can get really accurate results still. So potentially it seems to be really good at saying, is this a frog or not a frog? And so maybe we never have to listen to another insect again, which would be fine with me. So there's a lot of ways we can also, for example, is this a cane toad out of range? So at the moment, there might be a lag of 1 or 2 months before we listen to a cane toad that's out of range, and we don't want that. So maybe it would help us prioritize threatened species, cane toads out of range, so that kind of stuff. You know, and the other thing is frogs are awful. There's up to 13 species of frog recalling in 60-second segments. So working on techniques to try and separate those to allow machine learning. It's all really exciting, and I kind of know what I'm talking about, but I really don't. So, you know, I'm involved in a lot of meetings, but Julia, the machine learning engineer, is doing a lot of that. But we're always keen for help and advice, so please do reach out.
Sounds
Hello.
like you've got
My
it
name
under
is Gabi.
control. Sorry, thanks.
We have this is the priority here, and then the online can come after, please. Same lady. Oh, same lady, okay. Sorry,
No, no, it's okay. Yeah.
Did she want to ask a follow-up? Okay, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm Gabi. I'm one of the volunteers going out looking for the coranda tree frog. And I just, when you mentioned flooding could be worse than fires, after the cyclone, sort of 1.5 years ago, the Barron River came up about 17 meters, and so much vegetation habitat was lost. And and we didn't hear them calling in certain areas for at least a couple of months. I just wonder if they would have had a chance to climb onto trees, or if they would have been washed away with the flooding, would they be smart enough? And if they got washed away, would they be able to survive somewhere else? But yeah.
Actually, not from FrogID, but from my radio tracking work between Townsville and Cairns during my PhD back in the day at JCU. When I had radio transmitters on frogs, stream frogs, so Latoria serrata included, they would just get away from the stream. So they knew, they weren't stupid, they went far away, and thankfully, because I didn't want to have to get near the stream. So my thoughts are that hopefully most of them did get out of the way and get far enough away from the stream that they weren't affected. Obviously, their habitat and their tadpoles is another thing. And, you know, it's likely that their tadpoles got washed to somewhere that was not suitable, if not the ocean. And then the breeding sites would probably take a while to recover. And certainly we've sort of seen that with Burralong frogs, which are another stream breeding frog in New South Wales as well. That, yeah, and then I guess not so bad up there, but potentially then bringing in introduced fish and things like that from other places has happened a fair bit where I work. But yeah, hopefully they come back. From a disease perspective, though, you know, all this, the rain and the flooding is also potentially makes things worse. It's nice and moist for the fungus. And that's maybe one reason as well that the fires and cyclones, this actual opening of the canopy, might actually be a little bit of a short-term pro just on the disease front anyway.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Jodi? Jodi, I just had one quick one. So you're converting distribution maps where you've got point data for a bunch of, or for a species, say for example, and then you're converting those into range maps. Are you using species distribution modeling, or how do you convert those points into maps?
We haven't as yet. So I'm working on another project that's kind of going to overlap with the FrogID map making, which is going to be doing species distribution mapping. And so we'll see how that changes our maps. We've been doing kind of sort of biogeographic regions, contiguous habitat, kind of soil types, kind of sense checking. But yeah, not species distribution models, but hopefully that will come and we'll see what that does.
Okay. Well, Jodi, thanks. That was one of the most interesting and kind of exciting, inspiring talks we've had here in a while, and we've had a few. So thank you very much on behalf of everyone else. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.